So I'm 4'11", and when I walked in, I asked, "Where's your box? Where's your speaker box?" So they got me a milk crate. So now I feel really tall. So thanks for coming this morning and for being part of this conversation. In November of 1991, at the age of 24, I attended a Young Women's Leadership Development Conference in Jamaica. It was my first experience of traveling outside of the first world and my first experience of the Caribbean. We were a small group of about 30 young women in our 20s from all parts of the world. Many of us were students, but some were also lawyers and ministers and activists from 20 countries across the globe. For 10 days, we shared stories of the political realities of our countries. We talked about the challenges that women faced in our contexts, engaged in feminist theology and Bible study, learned about the political and cultural realities of poverty in Jamaica, and we developed strategies to strengthen our own leadership skills. We ate together, swam together, prayed together, and played together. But mostly, we talked. We talked about our lives, our experiences, our families, our hopes and our dreams. For the first time in my life, I developed friendships with women whose life experiences were radically different from my own. A woman from Hiroshima made paper cranes during our discussions about how New Zealand had become nuclear free. She later shared with us her own experience of nuclear weapons as a second-generation survivor of the bomb. Her mother had been 3 years old in 1945 when the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. She lost both of her legs. Origami paper cranes became symbols of peace, following the story of a young girl diagnosed with leukemia 9 years after the bomb, who made 1,000 paper cranes, inspired by a Japanese legend that this would grant her wish to run again. Subsequently, paper cranes became associated with the anti-nuclear movement. This was just one of many stories from each region which shared the particular struggles and challenges that young women face in their contexts, including prostitution, anorexia, unwanted pregnancy, access to education, caring for children, dowries, violence, poverty, lack of jobs, rape, and many other issues. Some of these issues cut across cultures, while others were more specific to particular regions, cultures, or economic realities. Women from Sri Lanka and Lebanon and Liberia told about their experiences growing up in war-torn countries. And women from Asia spoke passionately about the growing problems of sex, tourism, prostitution, and the exploitation of women. One memory that is seared into my brain comes from a young Salvadoran woman named Daisy. Because she did not speak English and I do not speak Spanish, we had limited interaction during the off hours of the consultation. But the simultaneous translation provided during the meeting allowed all of us to communicate across language barriers. Late one afternoon, Daisy shared with us her own experience of the Civil War in El Salvador. I was familiar with the bloody nature of this particular political conflict as I had read a number of books and newspaper articles about the conflict, and one of my mentors had been under house arrest for participating in harboring illegals as part of the sanctuary movement in the United States. In response to the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero and 4 Catholic sisters in 1980, and the disappearance of countless civilians who were murdered by off-duty military personnel known as death squads, and the U.S. government's support of the Salvadoran military, many U.S. congregations organized what came to be known as the sanctuary movement. Sanctuary churches were local congregations that provided asylum and support for political refugees in the U.S., refugees that the U.S. government refused to recognize. Just 2 years before we were there, gathered in Jamaica, 6 Jesuit priests and their housekeeper and her daughter had been murdered, reigniting U.S. attention and interest in the crisis in El Salvador. Despite having read the stories of mass killings and unspeakable torture that the death squads had inflicted on the people of El Salvador, I was unprepared for Daisy's words. In the tropical setting of Ocho Rios, where we came together on neutral soil and lived for 2 weeks out of our suitcases, sharing common meals and tea times, and talking about the call of Christ in the world to challenge social injustice, I was deluded into the perception that as young women, the 30 of us had more in common than we did. Through tears, Daisy shared with us the painful memory of her own experience of the death squads. It had happened only a few years before. A death squad had broken into her home and killed everyone there, everyone except Daisy. She watched as her brothers and sisters, mother and father, were all gunned down in front of her. While we listened to her words through a translator, we watched as she spoke quietly of how she had escaped only because she lay still, pretending to be dead. The room was silent as the 30 of us listened to her story, each through the prism of our own life experiences, despite having read news reports of experiences that were very similar. Knowing Daisy changed everything, rightly or wrongly, because she sat across the room from me and I could look into her eyes. Her story moved me in a way that was different from the stories of people unknown to me. On one of the last days of the conference, we were all sharing with one another our plans for the future, how we understood God in our lives and what we were called to do. At the time, I was finishing up a 2-year appointment as a mission volunteer with the Justice for Women office of the National Presbyterian Church in the U.S. I planned to go to seminary and then possibly into the mission field. When I shared with the group that I felt that my calling was to help people, particularly the most marginalized in our society, and that I planned to do that in mission work in the two-thirds world, a young Nigerian lawyer stood up and addressed me from across the room. If you want to help me and my people, go back to the United States and deal with the powers of globalization that are destroying the people in my country. The IMF and the World Bank are headquartered in your country. I was caught short. I didn't know what to say in response. My training in the church and my experience of the world was such that I thought the most effective way to address social problems was to go somewhere over there and help people less privileged than myself. While my sense of responsibility for my privilege may have been well-intentioned, I have come to understand the world and my own social responsibility differently over the intervening 20 years. Shola's words were an epiphany for me. As we talked later about her challenging words, she helped me see that my social location as a U.S. American gave me a certain privilege of voice and access that she did not have, and that I could use my privilege and voice responsibly to educate North Americans about the problems of global poverty and injustice, as well as to challenge the dominant powers of the IMF and World Bank. Because we had developed a friendship, I was able to hear her words as the challenge of a sister and a friend, rather than the reproachful words of a stranger blaming me for the actions of my country. Building community together, studying the Bible, and working on tough issues of poverty, social injustice, and the oppression of women over a 10-day period challenged us to move beyond the pleasantries and ask each other hard questions about where we find God in the midst of today's world. For me, God spoke through the voice of Shola, calling me to account for my privilege and challenging me to follow Christ, working toward the establishment of peace and social justice, as the Lord's Prayer says, on earth as it is in heaven. There are two things I would like to highlight from my experience in Jamaica that relate to thinking about our search for multi-faith understanding. First, our social location in the world is an important factor in how we understand and interpret the world. The term social location refers to those aspects of our life, like our race, class status, gender, education, sexual orientation, geographic location, and age, that shape our experience of the world. The fact that 30 women who gathered in Jamaica came from 20 different countries was not accidental. The planners of the conference intentionally sought out a diverse group of participants, precisely because they knew that our varied life experiences would give us different lenses on problems of women and social injustice that were the focal point of our consultation. Learning how to listen deeply to people who are very different from ourselves is both challenging and potentially rewarding. We should not seek out difference in our communities, our classes, and our social networks because it is politically correct to do so. Rather, we strive for creating communities of difference precisely because of the wisdom and knowledge that arise from the different experiences that people have from their different social locations. As we think about multi-faith understanding, it is essential that we begin with an inward examination that includes acknowledging and understanding ourselves first. What is our social location? And how does it impact the way in which we both experience and understand our world? This includes the important factor of knowing the history, depth, and breadth of our own tradition before we engage in dialogue with people from other traditions, knowing who we are and what we believe and why. In other words, having a rich and critical understanding of our own faith is an essential foundation for meaningful multi-faith understanding. The second insight that my experience in Jamaica highlights is the critically important aspect of how personal experience, encounter with people who we might think of as other, and developing relationships is essential to developing a broader understanding of the world in which we live. Professor Kwame Appiah argues that experiences of cultural difference do more to open our minds to difference than reading or learning about difference. Elon is very interested in promoting cultural exchange and dialogue across lines of difference, including religious difference. There are increasing opportunities for students and faculty and staff to cross lines of difference, socially, culturally, racially, religiously, that seek to challenge us to learn about difference experientially, as Appiah describes. Of course, there is a danger of falling into what Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie has called the danger of a single story. In her well-shared TED Talk, Adichie warns of the dangers of critical misunderstanding if we encounter someone who is different from us and then extrapolate from that single encounter that all people who are X are like that person that we encountered. When we enter into dialogue with people from religious traditions that are different from our own, not only is it important to recognize that our tradition has a great deal of depth and breadth, and our experience of that tradition is singular to us, we must also remember not to fall into the trap of the single story and assume that all Muslims or all Jews or all Christians believe or practice or think like the one person that we have encountered. That said, developing significant personal relationships with real people who are different from us offers the possibility of changing the way we understand the world. My experience in Jamaica was truly a transformational moment for me, what in theology we call a metanoia experience. Shola's challenge to me was critical but authentic. It arose from her authentic struggle against the powers of economic globalization that were damaging her country, and from an exasperation with well-meaning Christians engaged in mission work. For our encounters to be truly transformational, they required her honesty and my willingness to listen and hear her words. Thinking about how to understand my privilege and leverage it to help promote social change has become the animating aspect of my professional life. Encounters like these can help us think about the world through the eyes of others. This is the promise and the hope of dialogue that crosses lines of difference.
I get to move around the box. Thank you, Toddy, for your words of encouragement and challenge and sharing a bit of your story with us this morning. We'll continue the conversation after a final piece of music out with coffee and donuts and bananas. On the back of your handout are a couple of upcoming things. A Christian Good Friday, Stations of the Cross service. Tomorrow, a winter term course, Holla for Hunger, and a last Peace in the World Religions, a Whirlwind tour. I'm glad you're all here. Thanks for being here, and I invite Sarah up to share with us.